Welcome to the Red Diamond Wargaming podcast. I'm your host, Major Kurt Locker Honig, and joining me today is Bernd Velling, recently retired of the German Luftwaffe. Bernd, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Please note that all opinions expressed are entirely those of the participants and do not reflect the United States Marine Corps, their units, or any other organizations of which they are a part. So, Bernd, I'm going to kick it off to you. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about your background and how you came into wargaming?
Okay, well, background. Well, I'm gonna go all the way back. Born 1970, so yes, I'm officially old. Joined the German Luftwaffe in '89 as a draftee. So a month after I joined, the wall fell. So it was a very, very different time to be going in. Lucked out, fast forward, long story short, ended up in February of 1992. I crossed the boundary into NATO service and never left. And was with NATO until I retired April 1st this year. So in multiple different jobs, flew on AWACS for over 22 years as a communications was my specialty, but also then from there became a joint interface control officer. So I'm the guy that brought all the data streams together. And eventually 2017 came over here to the US, posted in two different NATO commands. So in the end, I did 33 years of consecutive NATO service, and it's like people always ask me, how did that happen? I'm like, it was an accident, it wasn't intended. It wasn't anything that, I mean, the reason I'm in this wonderful country here with you and be able to talk to you today is the fact that my wife is American. We met flying NATO E3s together, NATO AWACS together. She was US Air Force, and I'm Luftwaffe, and here we are. So true NATO story, so to speak. Wargaming. I've always had, well, wargaming really started for me way back when I think I was like 12. My parents sent me off to England, not because they wanted to get rid of me, but my mom was from Belgium, my dad was from Germany, so I grew up multilingual. I grew up speaking, Dutch/Flemish, a smattering of French was in there because our Belgian family was half and half French, and well, French speaking and Dutch speaking. And then, of course, German through my dad. And at one point in time, my mom said that when I started taking English in high school, which for us, high school started at fifth grade, my mom was, today we would call it immersive learning. My mom was like, I want you to learn English in England, like immersed. And she reached out to her old school in Belgium, who in turn reached out to a former student of theirs who had married an Englishman, who was a Cambridge educated English teacher. And that was the family I stayed with. So if I got tired of speaking English, I could always fall back to Dutch, which was great. It was kind of like my life anchor. And through England at the time, and still has a huge wargaming background. So you walked into shops at the time. I mean, I grew up on stuff like Panzerblitz, Squad Leader. That was my first exposure to wargaming, because obviously in Germany at the time, games like that weren't something that was available for obvious reasons. When you're 0-2 in history, and it's like that stuff like that rarely gets shown. And I was fascinated by it. It was always fascinating. Squad Leader, which with its building block approach was a great way to get into it. Also great for scenario building. I mean, from day one, you could be like, oh, I'm going to play with this. I'm going to mess with that. It's interesting. In the edit notes at the end of the Squad Leader game book, they basically said, like, hey, if you ever want to go back to the roots, take any scenario, take everything else out, and just leave it to infantry, machine guns, and leaders. Go back to the front, basically. And that was an interesting concept as well. So Squad Leader, Panzerblitz, Richthofen's War, that's the kind of games that I grew up with. And another thing, one of my favorite authors, Tolkien. So I read The Lord of the Rings the first time and completely when I was 12.
Mm-hmm.
And I have read it, I think, 8 times since. And, whoever ever read The Lord of the Rings and is a wargaming person, and gets to the chapter of Helm's Deep and doesn't want to recreate that as a war game, there's something
Sure.
wrong with you as far as I'm concerned. And I did. I created my own war game of the Attack of Helm's Deep,
Hmm.
and eventually ended up creating a whole series, basically. So that is of, designed my own gaming system, my own system. As far like it was all D6 based at the time,
Fair.
and so you had X amount of characters. So life points that you were given to more. Like Gimli had like I think 8 life points at the time and could only lose one at a 6 or something like that. So I mean, you kept it. And they could get healed in certain scenarios and whatnot. So and of course there was a smattering of Dungeons and Dragons in there. Which
Sure.
it's like you always take that into consideration. From Dungeons and Dragons, it wasn't far to eventually getting to Warhammer.
Hmm.
Warhammer Fantasy initially, Warhammer 40,000 later, which I have avidly played on and off for well, at least 25 years, more than that, probably about almost 30 years by now. Unfortunately, it's always hard to find the time to game because it's a very intricate game.
Sure.
Um, and then from there, the whole wargaming took on like inside the Air Force. Like when I got to NATO E3s, wargaming took on a whole different thing. I had a couple of years into it, I found something called Harpoon, which is a lot of people will go, "That's a video game." Like, no, it did not start its life as a video game. It actually started its life as a tabletop game,
Hmm.
and like the video game, as with so many applications, video game doesn't even get close.
Right.
But anyway, so I ended up stumbling across the system, and it's interesting to see Harpoon is really not a game.
Hmm.
It's more a simulation system.
Right.
And it always fascinated me because at heart, I'm a tactical level kind of guy. It's like everybody wants to be on the deck, so to speak, and Harpoon gave you all the options. And if you've looked at um, it's actually, if you look around, if you Google Harpoon 5 Jumpstart, you will find a basic scenario that can be found online and can be downloaded for free just to take a look at how the game mechanics work. And the detail is astounding.
Right.
I mean, for those people that's what I love. I love the intricacy of it. It's like, yes, it's complex, but so is real war fighting. So,
Well, if I
and
remember
it's
correctly, yeah, Harpoon actually had two different, I don't want to call them levels, but almost two different experiences. One where it was you actually had all the physical inputs that a crew member would have to do in order to execute all the things that
oh
a
yeah,
ship driver would have to do. And at one point they had to kind of stop and say, "Hey, like this you're creating a level of complexity that like it's a useful training tool, almost like you're describing a simulation, but the actual decision making, the force on force concept, you can't dive too deep into the button pushing. You have to actually allow just the decisions to be what fuels the progress of the game."
yeah, and especially if you look into um, detection,
Mm-hmm.
um, you look at line of sight, thermocline layers for sonar, you know, um, the air-to-air side of the house, like the actual resolution of air-to-air combat is very short and brutal, which is very realistic.
Mm-hmm.
What I love about Harpoon, for example, is the planning process is great. Like for air, I mean, you really have to sit there and figure out a tanker plan,
Right.
which I wish some people in the real world would do that once in a while. So, I mean, the amount of times that I stumbled across them, it's like, well, this just like, and especially in simulation, when we ran simulations, there was a lot of times when I ran, because the simulations that I ran was we were in the sim for the mission crew, and you would basically start at a certain point in time. And of course, you could create all kinds of stuff like, I don't know, we got these 20 aircraft that magically got to this point, and we're going to start the Cameo run now, or 40, or whatever. And then when you start asking questions like, how did those airplanes actually get there? And people are like, stop with the realism. You can't talk about that. So that's the whole part. And I asked, so going back to my flying time, that's the kind of questions I asked when I started flying and when I sat down and I built scenarios, and I did it for training for the people in my crew position, which initially I was comms, but in order to draw a better picture for my people that I taught,
Hmm.
I would sit them down and be like, okay, let's look at this through the God's eye perspective. So I drew out the plan, like this is how this goes, and I used Harpoon as a tool to do that.
Nice.
Which is like I said, it's a phenomenal system, and then it's to this day, it's like actually I actually have Harpoon 5, even though it's a little older. I got Harpoon 5, which they even took it further. I mean, they got like radar ducting
Mm-hmm.
in there. I mean, there's so many different details, so I can only highly recommend it. And I know for a fact they actually have taken this game and with the application of classified information, they have used it for real life training.
Sure.
Which is, I think it's a great way of doing business. It's a great way of doing things. So you have that option. So Harpoon was always my weapon of choice, so to speak, when it came to the tactical level. On a more operational level, Victory Games Fleet Series
Mm-hmm.
is definitely a great tool that I used in the past. And that was kind of funny because all the wargaming I did while I was aircrew, it was kind of like I did that on the side. It was one of those until somebody clued in. You wargaming? And I'm like, yeah. It's kind of funny how something that was during high school time was like, oh, you're a nerd. I'm like, nerds will rule the world, man. Eventually it turned into a valid tool,
Absolutely.
which is something that a lot of people tend to underestimate, and which we have done that a lot. Where you talk to people, and it's like, do we really need this?
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, no, you do. And I've been through this in many units. The last unit I served with, just to sketch background. So I did aircrew from 92 to 2014. 2014 to 2017, I was stationed in Mons, Belgium, on the NATO AWACS staff as their JICO. Then from 17, I came over here. Okay, went to Allied Command Transformation, and there is actually where kind of wargaming kind of fell into my lap again. It was kind of funny because when they started working on something called AFSC, Alliance Future Surveillance and Control Systems, um, just by accident, I got roped into the vignette testing
Nice.
for, and they had scenarios. And so I looked at the scenarios and I'm like, have we actually wargamed these ideas? And they kind of looked at me like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, have we actually taken these and kind of like murder boarded them and put them through a ringer?
Right.
And the answer was no, of course. And then we did. And some of the outcomes were, ooh, that's not what we thought that would happen. I'm like,
Right.
well, it's like, I mean, the dice rolls do have something to do with it, but overall, the gist of the thing. Um, and it's something that you could even, one thing that I used or that I was exposed to at Allied Command Transformation, which was very interesting, was Matrix Wargaming,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
another good tool, because that just, a lot of it is notional and discussion,
Right.
which is very good. So like I always use the Matrix. The Matrix war game was more a discussion starter.
Right.
I mean, with the Matrix war game, you went ahead and basically were like, okay, we're going to generally go into this direction. But what I loved about the Matrix wargaming was the fact that I could take people that had really no big background,
Mm-hmm.
give them a couple of data points, and just let them run with it. And we did Arctic scenarios in a workshop in, I want to say, 2019. Yeah, something like that. We had something called the Innovation Week at ACT,
Mm.
and they were like, "Hey, Wedge, can you do, would you mind doing like the facilitator for the Matrix games?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And it was just because a lot of people shy away from facilitating. I love doing it because it's just great to see the reactions of every single group. Like there's
Sure.
there's no way every single group you get will get a different result with the same scenario, which is
Right.
just awesome to see.
Yeah. Well,
We
and
had
and
that.
you can't understate the importance in the role of a facilitator, right?
Oh,
Like a
absolutely.
facilitator absolutely can make the difference between this becoming a roll your eyes, get through it evolution versus players walking away. And by players, this could be crew members on the AWACS. It could be admirals that are actually moving the ships and the airplanes around
Hmm.
on the board, and all walking away with different lines of thinking, different ways of thinking of solving the problem because of the way a game is facilitated.
Yeah.
So absolutely is an incredible responsibility, and it's one that we simply don't. And I capture this we. I'm putting some words in a NATO representative right now, putting in your mouth that we as NATO aren't doing enough, because I know we as a Marine Corps and a United States military is probably not doing enough to make sure those facilitators are armed with enough resources, enough opportunity to run games
Oh,
in a way
absolutely.
to really support those decision makers.
Well, sometimes I think it's the old story of be careful what you wish for, you might actually get it.
Sure.
Um, so, what I always did is just let it run.
Mm-hmm.
Let the game run where it goes. And which obviously, if you're trying to run a war game in order to prove or not prove a certain goal, and the outcome is not what is intended,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
doesn't make you friends necessarily. Um, that was one of those things that, and I've seen it at tactical, I've seen it at operational level. You see it all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always a good starter for thoughts. And I have thought it's kind of like you talked about admirals, you talked about crew members. One of my most thankful clients, for lack of a better term,
Mm-hmm.
were always civilians
Yeah.
because of the fact that it shows them an aspect that they have never thought about before.
Sure.
So, and it was actually kind of fun when I did the Innovation Matrix game. I'm like, the ruthlessness that came out of some people was hilarious to watch. I'm like, you just did what? So it was great, so, and it was a really great discussion starter. But
There's
you're absolutely right. I think that wargaming as a tool is
mm-hmm.
underused.
it, it
Absolutely.
it is a very real. I don't know if concern is the right word, but a lot of times the most exposure a civilian will have to the military is through cinema.
Hmm.
And if for no other reason, then we know some of the decisions that are made in the movies have to do with how many airplanes can you fit onto the screen while still telling a story that is not an accurate depiction of what's going on. You're joking about
Of
Pearl
course not.
Harbor,
Yeah.
you're learning all kinds of new things about Pearl Harbor. The thing that no movie can really encapsulate is how big the Pacific Ocean is. And
Yeah.
it's not until you war game something like that says, "All right, I've moved my ship out here." I'm like, "Cool, now that ship is out of fuel."
Yeah.
Like what?
Exactly.
Now what? And so now you have a civilian who, well, maybe that's not a an example of ruthlessness by the part of a civilian, but it's definitely the application of, in the movies they just went over there and did the thing. Like, cool. This is not the movies. So now we're learning something incredibly valuable, which is all of your assets require other considerations than just being in a spot.
Yeah. But it's well, I know it from having worked tactical data links for 95% of my career.
Hmm.
And I used to call it the biblical approach to link. The link just is.
Right.
One of the first verses in the Bible, fiat lux, and there was light. We turned it into fiat link, and then there was link.
And there was Link.
Which is clearly that is the thought pattern that a big part. I'm not going to put a percentile on it, but a big part of leadership looks at dots on the screen and goes, "Well, they're just there."
Right.
And the how they get there is heavily underestimated.
Hmm.
And logistics. I tend to be one of those things, and that was one of the great things I thought about OWS. For example, speaking of that, since that's how we met, in OWS, I love the fact that there is a logistics part in it.
Yes.
You can physically run out of ammunition,
Yeah.
you know, which you do that. That's one of the things I loved about Harpoon. I mean, as detailed as that is, at one point in times you are out of tomahawks, you are out of
Hmm.
Harpoon, you are
Hmm.
literally out of everything,
Yep.
and then it's back to guns.
Yeah.
So literally,
And
I
and I,
ran a scenario once, which was very interesting. There was um, a great scenario. Well, it was not a book. It's a campaign book. So like Harpoon, the old Harpoon system and the new one had different campaign books, and one of them was the Falklands War,
mm-hmm.
and they had some amazing scenarios in there. And one scenario that I ran was a task force that actually ran against Admiral Belgrano.
Mm,
So what would have happened? Let's what if what would have happened if Conqueror had not taken out that ship?
right.
And you know, because of the fact that it's such an old ship, it's like it has a lot of redundancy, has a lot of armor. It takes a lot of firepower to sink that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point in time, the UK side simply ran out of missiles.
Mm-hmm.
Because some of them get intercepted. It's like not everything hits, not everything gives you, and it's an old battle cruiser like that has a lot of stamina. It can take a lot of licking. And the thing actually got into gun range with a Type 42 and literally blew it to bits, blew it to bits.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a very interesting lesson learned for the people that I ran the game with. They were like, there was a lot of realization, like, dang, it's kind of like the discussions you have about, like Russian warships. Like I can't wait, especially with, since they just put that old Kirov back into the water.
Trying. Yep.
Yeah, well, yeah, she's out there floating around somewhere. Um, and I actually have a scenario for Harpoon where you run an airstrike against a Russian SAG. And that's something that, yeah, it takes a lot of iron to sink that thing.
It is. It is a historic example, and this is something that the creator of Operational Wargame System, Tim Barrick, I know he runs into this situation all the time. Like, how many hits does it take to sink anything?
Hmm.
And this becomes historic. I mean, we had to give up the Yorktown for loss in Midway. Sorry, in the
Hmm.
United States in World War
You
II.
guys.
Yeah, and yeah, so different. I don't think it's still a sore subject, but different theaters. So we're gonna push. But
Yeah.
the idea was like, hey, like we can't tow this thing back. It's not sunk yet. So what do? We can't leave this thing here. It's like we're gonna have to
Hmm.
help sink it. And like what a crazy concept that this thing had been hit repeatedly by air bombing attacks by the Japanese. The thing is on fire. It's listing way to the side, and the sucker just won't sink. And
Hmm.
then you fast forward now to 2025, where there's a major exercise where they got to use a decommissioned vessel for just straight up torpedo practice. And this
Hmm.
is not an aircraft carrier. This was just, if I remember correctly, a destroyer,
Hmm.
and that thing would not sink. It takes
It
a
would not
lot
die.
to sink a ship. Now, it doesn't mean it could fight, but what it does is it really forces that the fidelity, the true nature of what is the actual capability. Like, you hit it with an anti-ship missile, that's awesome. You might have disabled it, but it might also still be there. It might still
Hmm.
have the ability to close with and now hit you with a different weapon system that you are not accounting for. That
Yeah.
no amount of anti-missile system is going to stop that Type 42 gun from actually putting holes
Yeah,
into your
exactly.
ship.
Yeah. So, I mean, and if you look at the gunfire, for example, like I always thought it was interesting that, we went like after the battleship era was over, the biggest thing you're going to find on a NATO vessel is a 5 inch,
Hmm. Hmm.
under 27 mil, single barrel usually. If you're lucky, you might have two turrets, most like sometimes only one. In the case of a Perry class, you only had 176 millimeter.
Yeah.
That was sitting on the deck house aft. But then again, the Perry had a different job.
Right.
So gunfire power was not necessarily something that was high on people's mind.
Hmm.
It's more like, oh, we're in the missile age now, and it's like, let's go back to the Vietnam War. Let's take a look at, and I ran that going back to my Avalon Hill days. There's a great game called Flight Leader,
Mm.
which is awesome for air to air. For those of you that ever want to look this up, one of the best air to air games there is. flight leader, and you could run, we basically reran the scenario between friends just for taking a look at it. What would have happened, or what did happen to the Americans, is when the F4 was brought, and everybody had decided we are in the missile age now, but then they get to North Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese have decided we're not in the missile age, we're still in the gun age. We're flying MiG-17s and MiG-19s with guns, and once you're out of air-to-air ammunition, you're literally a flying target. And you're like, oh crap, and with the weight ratio of a MiG-17 versus that of an F4, and the AIM-9 at the time not being all that sophisticated as it is now, all of a sudden you're like, basically the guy outflies the missiles, and then again they had to take drop tanks in order to get there. So it's like in most cases, most caps would only come with 4 missiles, so you only have 4 shots, which is not a whole lot. Especially if you're fighting somebody above their own territory.
Right.
So, and then you're like, oh crap, we're still in the gun age. And it's the same thing if you look at a Russian surface action group and the amount of artillery fire. Like if you have a Sovereign Mini, for example, that you bring to the fight, now you got 2 twin 130 millimeter guns at your disposal. Like, I mean, if I were somebody, for example, that had to do naval gunfire support and I could steal a Sovereign Mini somewhere, I'd be like, that's my target.
Right.
Because you can still put a lot of metal on target with that ship. Which, that's one of the things that, again, through wargaming, I was able to demonstrate that to people that, we don't really have a lot of that anymore. That's wargaming I have is an amazing tool just to bring realities home. But it's usually those realities, and I think you pointed towards it with what Tim said, how many hits does it take to take a ship out? How many, it's a lot of that learning happens down at the TAC level. We're going to get into the knife fighting range and do this. Another great thing that I used war games for, which is not necessarily the game in and of itself, but the planning process.
Right.
And again, Harpoon, brilliant, great. I had a great scenario that was based on one of the missile strikes that the U.S. did in Iraq back in the 90s, and it's actually based on true strikes. Which one was Air Force led, which had F-117s, F-16s, a couple of EF-111s, and then the Navy side was A-6s, Prowlers, and Hornets. And a couple of F-14s as cap at the time, I think. So but the cap wasn't really a big deal because there was no Iraqi air-to-air resistance. So the scenario is very interesting because each player gets pulled into reverse roles. So you play the Air Force side against the Iraqi side, and then you play the Navy side against the Iraqi side, and then you flip roles. So, and you have what I did at the time. I gave the gamers or the players, for the people that did the strikes, I'm like, okay, you got 45 minutes to weaponize to load your aircraft. Here's your list of weapons you have available. I mean, the scenario gave you have X amount of 2,000 pounders, X amount of harms, X amount of this, X amount of that. 45 minutes, time is ticking. And 45 minutes sounds like a lot, but not when you have to up arm and plan a strike.
That's right.
And it really put people in the driver's seat, and they loved it. They were like, this is so cool. It's like, and in the end, almost the outcome of the game didn't really matter because everybody just loved the gaming aspect, the planning aspect of it.
It is one of my favorite components of OWS. It's one of the things that I can't wait to bring to future units, which that I get to be a part, and mostly just because, how we expect the future fight to go. When you are the player and you are doing your planning process, you put the clock on it and you start to realize, like, I need a different way to approach this. There's just too much for one person to really track. It shows you that centralization is not the way to go. Somehow you need to decentralize. Somehow, I know the U.S. Army is using Mission Command, but like commander's intent needs to be effectively communicated down to a smaller level. And I would love to see that expanded into some of the larger exercises where I
Hmm.
want to see aircraft flying around, doing tankers, taking off of aircraft carriers. All that is incredibly important and phenomenal. But it's not going to challenge decision making. It's not going to test our ability to collect information and communicate commander's intent down to the different unit leader levels. I'd like to see a war game force people into separate rooms. You only
Hmm.
know what you know. You only know what you can detect and what higher has told you about. Does
Hmm.
and then every however long, I would love to see every 2 hours everyone stop what you're doing and we're going to take a picture of the board and we're going to see if everyone's board looks the same. We're going to see
Hmm.
where the gaps are. If for another reason, then that is going to highlight, to your point earlier, the dot on the map is not always going to be the only way that you can look at a situation.
Yeah.
Just because, one, we don't know if it's been communicated effectively, despite your data links, right? I know you
Hmm.
trust your data links very thoroughly, but we're also entering an age of cyber where you have to have a little bit of doubt into what your screen is telling you, because the worst thing that you can make is that single point of failure that says, I know where all my pieces are, and that turned out not to be the case.
Well, you never exactly. And having said that, do I trust my data links? Yes, to a certain degree.
Right.
But I'm telling you one thing, like, and this is where, I probably get that's another one where, people are like heresy, so
Yeah.
I'm like, I am I'm gonna trust a data link that gets to me through an RF.
Mm,
I am not a fan of, like, I know everybody is like cloud-based this and cloud-based that
right.
and all this other fun stuff. And um, one of the things that I did during wargaming, one of the things that I did when I was a crew evaluator on AWACS, I was a communications evaluator, and we did crew evaluations because I was part of the standardization division. I would walk on to the aircraft, like we take off, and I would walk up front to the communications console, so my realm, and I would reach over and turn the Link 16 terminal off.
Sure.
And I'm like, well, guess what? You have no link. And the CT would give me that deer in the headlights stare and be like, oh, which it was coordinated with, my leadership that was part of the group, but the initial shock reaction of the crew was, even when they knew it was coming, they knew when they saw me walking on the plane, who's going to walk up there and turn the Link 16 terminal off. And I'm like, well, if you know it's coming,
You should be
did you
prepared. It shouldn't
prepare
bother
for it?
you. Hmm.
Yeah. And so I do the same thing like in war games, where I'm like, okay, like you don't have everything, like things are, are gonna go away, which that actually turns around. That's a very interesting aspect to what I do now. We're gonna like sidestep into that a little bit. Like right now, I actually got after I got retired, I got hired by a U.S. company called Vectrona. I don't know if we can put it like, but I'll send you. That's something we can later on. I don't know if you can add a link to this, but I'll send you a link.
Sure.
But what they do is they have taken a very high interest in training. And one of the systems that I work on, they have gamified on a computer, they have gamified air-to-air controller training
Okay.
and mission system operator training. So the mission system operator training gives you more the God's eye view, so
Hmm.
more where does the dot come from? And air-to-air starts, basic reps, two versus two, um, air control. So gives a good fidelity AI supported, and so it goes after basic capabilities. Controlling 101. Which is great. Because it refreshes a lot of things. So. And we always laugh, like when we bring this as a demonstration, like it's the old school controllers are like, I'm not going to touch this thing. It's like, because I'm actually going to have to realize that certain things I do are not according to the book, because the system will
Yeah.
mercilessly, because it's set up in accordance with the standard, so it will mercilessly ding you if you don't,
Right.
which is great. It's the way it's supposed to be. And but it also shows you that basic 101 stuff is where it is with all the. This goes back to what I said earlier about squad leader. You take all the guns away, you take all the artillery away, the airplanes, the tanks, the gizmos, and bring it back down to the bare bones of infantry and machine guns.
Hmm.
That's the basic. That's what drives things. It's like, and I know. a lot of my army friends like the infantry is the queen of the battlefield. I'm like, well, yeah, it's like noticed because you have to have boots on the ground in order to secure an objective.
Yes.
And that is something that I know that's where my Air Force background friends are always like heresy if I say that. I'm like, we as the Air Force, we were always the facilitator. We're going to level quite literally in certain cases, depending on how many bombs we drop. We're going to
Right.
level the playing field for you, the battlefield for you. But taking the objective is boots on the ground.
Correct.
And that is something again in a scenario like squad leader. Even Harpoon, the newer versions have a lot of littoral combat, unmanned stuff. Everything comes together. But in the end, you want to secure that objective, there needs to be somebody standing and planting that flagpole.
Yes.
True statement, so, and it's, I know but I think what you mentioned earlier, right at the beginning when we talked, I think it's before recording, but anyway, coming back to the point you made where you have all the circles and they're talking inside their circle,
Right.
but the circles are not intersecting.
Right.
And I've seen that so many times. I was able to be part of a war game called the Transatlantic Command and Control war game in Newport, Rhode Island. And I got to go at my last command at Joint Force Command Norfolk, which is NATO's newest command on U.S. soil. There's two NATO commands on U.S. soil, just in case. I know a lot of people are like, they're here. And I'm like, yes, we are.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it was called TAMC2, Transatlantic Maritime Command and Control. Hence, you notice it said maritime. So in this war game, there was a big tendency of people when they planned airstrikes, it was all, we're going to alpha strike from the carrier. We're doing this, we're doing that. It was all Navy driven. The fact that you had, and this played over in Europe, so I dared raise my hand and ask the question, like, have we considered using land-based long-range strikes? Have we put a request for support out, like B1s, B2s, that kind of thing? Oh my God, I was like, the pyre was waiting. It was like, this is a maritime command and control thing. And I'm like, well, I hate to break it to you, but any long-range strike you fly is going to be combined fires.
Right.
And especially, for example, now if you're looking into your scenario where, I was playing over in the Baltic, and you're going to have coordinated strikes between artillery, long-range air, maritime launched, surface to surface. Everything has to get there at the same time, and in order to get the maximum effect.
Right.
And they just looked at their. It was
That's
like
right.
maritime command and control. I mean, it's like, and we had a carrier. Part of the scenario was you had a U.S. carrier in the Mediterranean, and they were going to single-handedly fly that airstrike just with that carrier, while they're sitting next to Italy,
Yeah.
which has a Aviano air base. And I'm like, well, we could simulate it, ask for at least combat air patrol support, or you could have Ramstein over in Germany, which is, the string plank. You could park tankers there and get a long-range airstrike. So I threw out ideas, and yeah, that was not very well received. It's like, no, you can't have that. It's like, we need to do this by ourselves. And I'm like, no, you will not do this by yourself.
Yeah.
And then again, this is where, that's what we talked about earlier. Sometimes people don't want to hear,
Sure.
which, now being out of the military, I could talk about that kind of thing, where I'm like, it's one of the great things about working with the company I work for. My boss is a former F-14 driver, and he knows. And he's like, no, this is great. And this is where Vectrona was really pushing hard. And the good thing about the system, the game system that Vectrona came out with, as opposed to a lot of other systems, it was, companies will design something and then they go out, this is great, you need to buy this. It's like in our case, it was actually the reverse thing. U.S. Air Force came to us and go, we have an issue. We have an issue with the fact that we have a backlog of air controllers that are waiting for training. And that's where we came in. And if you look at the manpower it takes to run a simulation. Now, we used to call it the kitchen back home in Germany, like when we ran it. So we had the simulator, and the kitchen, which is the other side, which is the voice in the off, so to speak.
Mhm.
If you ran a maritime scenario, it would take you anywhere between 7 to 10 people to run it right. You
Sure.
know, I would sit on that side and be like, Alpha Whiskey. I was the air warfare commander. I was the guy shooting. I was playing the Tycho class. I was playing the DDG or whatever. It's
Mhm.
like in
Mhm.
order to be the guy that shoots the missiles at the leakers or whatever. Then you had two guys that did the voices for the fighters. You had a guy that did the voice for the bunker. And. But it took a lot of people to do this,
Mhm.
to do it right. And now we've taken this, they have taken that idea and gamified it on a laptop, which is huge. But it was based on an input from the Air Force. It was not something that were like, hey, came up with and like, well, we need to go tell you this. So this is one of the few things where I was like, one of the things where I was like, no, this is wargaming on a computer,
Mhm.
um, where it's very supportive for training, which is cute, which is great. But again, it focuses on the tactical level.
Right.
You know, baseline 101. The higher you get in level, sometimes, and I've seen the articles where people are very, very enthusiastic about using AI for wargaming.
Yeah.
I have a I kind of have a split thought about this, because in the end, when you and I sit together over a board like we did at OWS,
Mhm.
you know, um, we might come up with ideas that no AI has ever thought of
Sure.
because of our background, because you look at it from a Marine Corps perspective, I look at it from, an old school NATO perspective, I look at it through things that I have seen, you know, um, as I said, I have seen things you people wouldn't believe, so
Yeah.
I just don't run nails through my hand in order to prove it, so,
Fair. Yeah. It's
but
that.
that's the big thing.
Yeah, and I do think that that type of software, that type of digital gaming is incredibly useful going forward. It thrills me that the Air Force is working on something like that. I'd love to
Oh, yeah.
see that expanded in that kind of joint environment. The same idea where you're losing the number of people that physically have to be in the room to create the scenario. The scenario can be created and represented by, now a controller is simply pushing the ships instead of
Hmm.
playing the actual voice of one
Yeah.
particular ship and what they're doing. And I'd love to see that explored in a joint environment,
Yeah.
because there is a lot of sitting around time. That's something that I think the military is the epitome of hurry up and wait.
Oh, we are.
And what we're missing is the opportunity to really exploit those wait times. So those
Hmm.
wait times are missed opportunities to use software like that to just get sets and reps of, okay, but what if this?
Well,
And
let me
it
show you
doesn't have
something real
to.
quick.
Yeah.
I'm gonna walk around, which is great. And speaking of time utilization,
Mm.
let's see where we are. This is it.
All right.
Now it's the whole system. You can utilize. You can sit down. One air intercept scenario will take you about 4 minutes,
Hmm.
and you can do, like you said, building reps.
Yep.
And I am proud to tell you that the United States Marine Corps has woken up to it already.
I.
We actually showed that to one of your Marine Air Reserve, the MAX 24, Marine Air Control Squadron 24. That's a reserve unit, and they are home based here in Virginia Beach. And I was actually able to go out and show this to them.
Hmm.
And one of our best one-liners. I hope this thing doesn't beat me out now, but leave it to the Marines to call it like it is.
Sure.
And one young Marine looked at this and go, "This shit is fucking sick, man."
Yeah.
And we're saying we kind of redacted it but it's one of our best comments we ever got. I mean, those
Sure.
kids loved that game. I
Yeah.
mean, I had people coming off a 12-hour shift and they stayed behind to play because they were like, this is awesome. This is great. So it's the air controllers loved it. The mission system operators There's a lot, even the air controllers that usually don't do a lot of mission system op stuff
Hmm.
got exposure to it. Again, in a very minimalist environment, but this is great because, like you said, this is how you push it. It's like you've basically reduced the man hours it takes to get something like that on the street,
Right. I
which
think
is huge.
one of the best examples, and it really ties all of it together in a bow for me. What we've talked about in terms of the value of wargaming, how to make a wargame effective,
Hmm.
not getting sucked into just looking through one hole altogether. Um, you've made the game compelling. It's exciting for players to play, so they are training, they're enjoying it. That's valuable. I liken it to the amount of manpower it took to properly train my fire support team. So at a company
Hmm.
grade level where I am supervising a team that incorporates close air support, indirect fires from artillery, indirect fires from mortars, and ultimately that rifle company on the ground closing with and destroying. The phrase we like to use is symphony of destruction. It
Yeah.
does you no good if you have an aircraft comes in and it plays its part beautifully, right? The trumpeter stands up and he delivers this amazing, beautiful rendition of his part. Means nothing because we did not effectively suppress, right? The violins and the
Yeah.
just the clarinets and flutes, like all these other instruments failed to get their parts. I played saxophone myself, so they're not usually predominant in the orchestra, but still really really valuable part, I think. Um, if they're not all playing together in the symphony, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't work. You've exposed an aircraft to destruction. You've wasted ammunition for no exploitation.
Yeah.
To simulate that required a lot of people because you had your joint terminal air controller, your JTAC, to practice doing the air. He's busy playing both jobs. He's both submitting his 9 line for close air support and he's pretending that he's the aircraft.
Hmm.
Or you need someone else to come in and pretend to be the aircraft so he gets the repetitions of submitting the verbiage correctly that he's supposed to be saying. Same thing with the indirect fires. They're supposed to be submitting verbiage. You would need someone sitting behind him replying to everything that he's submitting just to make sure he's doing it right. To have a virtual system that can replicate that entire process so that that rehearsal becomes fun and useful. You're also now, instead of doing it one at a time, you're doing it synchronously the way it's intended because each one has their own radio system. Now it's
Hmm.
actually happening at a live speed. You're getting an actual repetition in this process of what it's actually going to be like. It's not a 3 hour, like, oh, this all would have taken about 12 minutes, but it took us over an hour because we only have so much support. No, the
Hmm.
game is now creating an environment where it's fast. It's showing you in real time. Or to expand that bubble, now you're not just doing a maritime, you're doing a joint fight. You don't have to spend a week to do the coordination necessary to bring in all the different assets.
Hmm.
You've done the planning and communicating on the front end, so your 0 week has already happened. And then the
Yeah.
game actually simulates what's going to happen live to see whether or not the effects are going to achieve what it is you actually want to see on the ground, which, like you pointed out, should ultimately result in boots on the ground, objective
Hmm.
seized. The victory
Yeah.
points, right? Helm's Deep was successfully defended. That victory point has been retained by the good guys.
Yeah.
Or if you're playing, on Saruman's side, right?
Yeah.
You've seized those victory points in Helm's Deep, right? Like that has
Yeah.
to be a real component of the game. That is a
Oh,
factor as
absolutely.
well.
Absolutely. And there has to be um, I guess for lack of a better term, willingness to lose.
Absolutely.
Because even out of a lost scenario, you can draw, everything is a result.
Hmm.
Even if you lose, there is no real lose. I mean, yeah, there's bragging rights, obviously, and like I sunk your battleship, so I mean, it's like, it's kind of like when they let us off the leash when we played OWS on the
Hmm.
laptops, and we
Sure.
finally got the ballistic missile
the, the
submarines, and we
the
were like,
Digicat. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, Digicat, and we were like nuking everything left, right, and center just to see what it looked like.
Sure.
But it's a it's I think the effect of recognition, the effect of realization
Hmm.
is something that explains a lot to people and like, oh, that actually makes sense now.
Hmm.
And one thing that I love to throw into my war games, because now I'm bringing something completely different, is let's throw in the legal aspect.
That is becoming, as I study and I learn more as a student
Hmm.
of warfare, is becoming more and more important to me. If for no other reason that now I'm seeing things in the news and I'm seeing different attitudes and approaches to the strategic level of warfare, right?
Hmm.
An extension of politics by another mean, Clausewitz, thank you,
Yep,
and beginning
you're
to
welcome.
recognize this might have been a tactical victory. Does that contribute to an ultimate strategic loss? Because there's a legal component, and not
Yeah,
even necessarily like, oh, this violates Title 10, this violates U.S.
yeah.
code, whatever. Unwritten international law, the justice bellow, right? Like, do we have a justification for doing something like this?
Hmm.
Um, it's a very real factor. I have not played enough games that really highlight that well. I've seen a couple of like a national morale meter
Hmm.
where as you make questionable choices, you'll see that diminish, and there is a failure state where if you lose too many of those morale points, you lose the game. So it does force you to be a little more ethical
Yeah.
in some of those decisions that you make. But you're absolutely right. That's a very real component if we're going to explore tactical, operational, and strategic. That as you reach that strategic level, that has to be a consideration.
Well, that was something that, I've actually been, I must say, exposed. As far as gaming goes, I was exposed to that very early because actually Squad Leader did have something called battlefield integrity.
Mm,
That was an add-on rule that, and then again, whoever has never ever played Squad Leader, I would highly recommend to get into that game. Even the old version, I still have the old versions. There's ASL, which was Advanced Squad Leader, but the like the building block approach was great, and battlefield integrity did not get added until I think like scenario 14. It was one of the expansion kits that added it, but it was literally based on your losses, your overall morale went down in your
mm-hmm,
force.
mm-hmm.
So it wasn't we're going to fight until the last man standing kind of thing, because unless you have a bunch of fanatics, that's not going to happen. So if you played a Japanese scenario, I guess that's a completely different ballpark, in the Pacific at the time,
Mm-hmm.
because it was like, there was no um, breakdown of battlefield morale for Japanese troops.
Right.
I mean, they would literally fight themselves to the death. Even when you play World War II scenarios, a Russian front, an Eastern Front scenario versus a Western Front scenario was decidedly different.
Yes.
As far as how people perceive, the odds and whatnot. Um, But what we did, and where I learned the hard way, I'm going to age myself here. Out of my 22 years of flying, I was very early exposed. I started flying in 92, and in 1992, I started to fly Bosnian missions
Mm-hmm.
on NATO E3s. So, which initially we covered, it was the UN. First, it was a maritime embargo, which later turned into a no-fly zone, and. But the rules of engagement were so strict and so tight that it did take I mean, it was a lot of, you had to ask for like, you had to ward off the radar only enemy aircraft when you then actually found one in the no-fly zone. It had to be warned 3 times
Hmm.
before you were even able to shoot at it. And you had to have a positive identification, and there had to be not just hostile intent, there had to be an observance of hostile action. So even if you caught a Serb fighter in the no-fly zone, by the time you'd done your 3 things, he was out of it anyway. I mean, more than once did we catch one, and then eventually, by the time we got our 3 warnings out, he was out of the zone anyway. And we learned all kinds of Serbian swear words listening to the guard radio, because they would answer in no uncertain terms. And that was something that where the legal aspect came into it. Because I mean, you can that entire 8 year thing that I got to fly showed me, like I saw everything from maritime blockade turning into a maritime enforced blockade, because it was initially called maritime monitor. So he just basically took notes as the
Yeah.
ships went by, slow, and then it turned into maritime guard, where the ships were actually allowed to fire warning shots, which was that was actually a very interesting development because it was very transparent. It was transparent, obviously, like that was a change that wasn't the people on the ships weren't aware of, or on the smuggler ships weren't aware of. And it was actually, I think it was a Belgian frigate that got to fire the first shot at anger across the bow of a freighter that was going to run the blockade with weapons for the Serbs.
Hmm.
And they basically hailed them as, you need to turn around. And they basically got, the proverbial middle finger shown. And then they opened fire with a 76 across the bow. And that ship 180'd in no time.
Hmm.
Because all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, they're actually shooting at us. So this then turned into, you know, uh, establishing the no-fly zone, which turned into what's called Operation Deny Flight,
Right.
where we had, 24-hour cap ops in the no-fly zone. And when I mean 24-hour ops, I'm not talking 24-hour people on the ground. I'm talking we had cap stations manned 24/7. We flew
Hmm.
AWACS missions 24/7. Um, I flew a lot of missions in that time. We controlled a lot of fighters in that time. So, which didn't have data link, by the way, at those times. We actually controlled them via voice. My controllers controlled them via voice.
Hmm.
So communications was a real thing. Um, but it's again, that's when the legal aspect came in. ROE was so stringent, all the way down to the first NATO air campaign, which happened that was 1995, was deliberate force, 95, 95, 96, one of those two. That was about the time when Scott O'Grady got shot down.
Mm. Right.
You know, um, he got actually shot down after the deliberate force. But, you're like, it was very, you had the Srebrenica massacre, stuff like that. Like again, you know, we had everything there to stop him, but we weren't allowed to. I know that for a fact because I flew 3 days of that.
Hmm. Right.
Yeah. So, and that is all something you can work into a war game, which I have done in the past, and that's why a lot of the scenarios that I run now, and I'm actually going to run a war game at JMU, with the students, which is going to be great.
Hmm.
It's going to be more of it's going to be a mixture of matrix, scenario driven, and then the tech level. I'm probably going to beg, borrow, and steal something from Harpoon in order to get that, um, because it's trying to get the point across for the student. It's a lot of legal stuff.
Hmm.
That is, for us, once we're past that shots fired part, when it becomes, beans and bullets, basically,
Right.
that's one thing. But I think we need to focus more wargaming on the legal impact. You know, which I've seen both sides of that. I've seen people, paralysis by analysis, where
Sure.
in a war game or in a scenario in an exercise, we were literally past Article 5, and people still were looking like we need to give them a diplomatic off ramp. And I'm like, there's literally red boots on the ground at target X on NATO territory. I'm like, so, and this is a war game, so we need to execute things. It's like, but it's interesting how even in a war game environment, even in a gaming or simulated environment, people are like, do I
Sure.
want to do this? So, and it's getting them to see the point of, no, you can actually launch a fighter. You can
Hmm.
actually, see how this works out. Let's go push it to the limit and see where we are. That's what wargaming is all about.
Hmm.
You know,
Well,
inside inside that.
Absolutely. And then for the James Madison students, your objective on these war games is the legal side of things. So you're
It's
building it.
part of it.
Okay.
I got hired on. Oh, it's something called Germany on Campus. It's something that's done by the German embassy. So they have me doing those scenarios with a focus on just to present how Germany would react in certain of these
Okay.
scenarios,
Okay. Very
which
cool.
is going to be very interesting. I'm really looking forward to this. Going to be some great discussions.
Yeah.
We're going to have a couple of round. I'm going to have round tables with the students before, so do discussion. It's like, and it's going to be great. I'm looking forward to it, and it's going to have legal aspects in it, but we're going to take it all the way to the brink.
Yeah. I hope
So
so.
which is going to be great.
Germany's in some of those fascinating times right now, just based on current events, ramping up some military production, but also now, speaking of the legality side of it, for the first time in 80 years, having legal permission to station troops outside of Germany. I'd be very
Yeah.
curious to see a couple iterations of war games that recreate a scenario, but with troops not just isolated to Germany homeland.
Hmm.
How does this scenario play if you also have units that are conducting joint exercises with these NATO countries? Does
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
change your diplomatic approach? Your off ramps, are they better or worse because Germany has that resource that until these past 2 or 3 years was not available legally, not available.
Hmm. Well, and I think it's one of those things. I think it's what a lot of people don't understand, and that's always funny how you point that out. While the people might be listening to this conversation and just like, what do you mean you don't want to use legal off-ramps? I'm like, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying we're not
Sure.
using legal off-ramps, but you need to realize when you're past the
Right.
legal off-ramp, when the legal off-ramp becomes a sign of weakness.
Correct.
And that is something that, it's like every off-ramp you take costs lives.
It's a strategic choice that has operational consequences.
Exactly.
A
It's
strategic
like, I
choice
mean,
of seeking a diplomatic solution could cost you operational effectiveness down the line.
yeah.
Absolutely.
And sometimes, you have to realize that, maybe that other side is just stringing you along.
It's been known
You
to
saw
happen.
it, we've seen it in, I'm not even talking about current events. I'm just like, I mean, we can have a whole other hour discussion about that.
Sure.
The fact that one country, Russia, is not interested in having peace. I wonder what gives it away. I mean, the fact that, even while they're having peace talks, they're bombing the crap out of Kiev. But that's a different story. I have seen it. I can show you the proof in that mindset when we dealt with Serbia
Hmm.
throughout, when did it stop? It stopped when we ran Operation Deliberate Force. The direct result of Operation Deliberate Force were the Dayton Accords. Um, and then after Allied Force, that's when, they were really, that's when NATO, without the UN, eventually decided, no, this is a humanitarian catastrophe because, I mean, that's when we had clear and irrevocable, caught red-handed proof, and even the legal people at NATO were like, we're done.
Yeah.
There is just nothing. And one of the press conferences I got to witness during the war, because it was very surreal, because we flew missions from Germany down into the Adriatic, stayed on station for 6 hours. It's like we were part of the 83 was part of the command and control structure to send the strikes in. And you come back home and you land and you go home and have breakfast.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm like,
That is
and then you
wild.
turn the TV on and you see a NATO press conference, and it's got like a building burning in Belgrade, or an oil refinery, that the strike that we controlled just hit, and you're like, this is weird, this is very surreal. But what happened in that specific press conference, which has always stuck with me, we had I can't recall what the man's name was. I think he was Irish by background. He was the spokesperson for NATO at the time. And there was a lady from Izvestia, Pravda, definitely a Russian outlet.
Hmm.
And she was like, have you considered the environmental impact of bombing this refinery? And his comeback was brutally brilliant because he looked at her and with that, I can't do the accent, but
Sure.
with that literally very cultured British Irish accent, looks at her and goes, "It's very interesting that you weren't complaining about the environmental impacts of 100 villages burning in Kosovo during the ethnic cleansing." And
Right.
that lady just
Yeah.
zip-lipped. I mean, she did not, there was nothing she could say anymore after that. She
Sure.
was done. But that is and you can play all this out, and having seen all that up front, that is something I can bring to the table, when I put a scenario like that together, and for everything that I put on the table, every scenario nuance that I pick, and I'm like, I can bring a fact that supports it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think
Absolutely.
that is what makes, coming back to the facilitation part, that's what makes it, it gives it the credibility, it's
Hmm.
like and I think that's don't think, like I was like, don't think you can't do it, just go run with it.
Yep. Well, I tell you what, Bern, I really appreciate your time. I'm very excited to hear an update both on the progress you're making with
Mhm.
Vectrona, the work that you guys are doing in that simulation, Wargaming type program, but then also how the students at James Madison get to experience your facilitation of. It sounds like it's going to be quite a compelling game.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, that's going to be great. I'm looking forward to it.
yep. Thank you so much for your time, for all of your insights, and I look forward to having you back on another occasion and get to hear some updates.
Oh, absolutely. It'll be my pleasure.
All right. You have a great rest of your day, Bern.
And to you.